Leak project. I'm with Lee Wheelbarger, and I see a pretty gnarly contrail in the sky right now, and I said, hey man, check out that chemtrail. Just joking. And it sounds like it's nucleation. So Lee's kind of giving me the scoop on why the color of the sky is different now, and he's got a differing opinion than most people, and I think it's very interesting. So hey Lee, how you doing, man?
Good, man.
Good. I like your hat.
Thanks.
Yeah, awesome.
Appreciate it.
So
Got really hooked up here. So.
We're actually on our way to go to Dulce, but this is a great talk on the way. So I said, hey, can I record this? He said, yeah. So check out his shirt too. You definitely want to subscribe to his YouTube channel, KLM World News.
KLW.
KLW. I was joking. I was just making sure he was paying attention. KLW World News. Okay, let's rock and roll.
All right. So as the sun goes into a minimum, and in this case, we're going into a grand solar minimum, and we know that because we've had at least 3 solar cycles that have decreased in amplitude by at least 30% on each of those cycles as far as the highest number of sunspot counts.
Okay.
So you have to so these are the requirements to have a grand solar minimum.
Less sunspots.
Yeah, you have to have 3 cycles in a row, and each one of those cycles has to be at least 30% lower than the previous cycle. Okay. So you get
and that makes just a solar minimum.
That's no. The solar minimum is just in between the sunspot cycles, where you have a peak and a minimum, and then a peak and a minimum again. That's a normal 11-year cycle, which for a full magnetic reversal is actually a 22-year cycle. So that's a solar minimum. A grand solar minimum is the peak activity decreases 3 cycles in a row by a minimum of 30%. Then on top of that, in either the 3rd cycle or the 4th cycle, there will be a double peak. Now, to have a double peak in a solar cycle is no big deal. It's only a big deal when the 2nd peak is higher than the 1st peak. And that is what I call the cavitation of the sun. It's just like when you're sucking water with a pump and it gets that first gulp of air in the line and it starts to cavitate. Mm-hmm. When it comes squirting out of the end of the line, it'll shoot farther. Okay. And then it stops. Mm-hmm. Well, the sun does the same thing. So when it starts going into this weaker field, and that's just what I'm talking about is the signature of it. You can talk to Valentina Zarkova, and she can tell you all about the electromagnetic fields and how they're going out of phase and canceling each other out.
She gives some pretty doomy news.
Well, she's just telling you what the magnetic field says. I mean, all you're looking at is a couple of strings on a guitar that are out of tune, and you're going to get that roll in the music. It's the same thing here. The magnetic fields are going out of phase. They're going to cancel each other out. But how that leads to the sky is, as the sun gets weaker, it gets more coronal holes in it. Those coronal holes stream out cosmic rays. And so you've got galactic cosmic rays, which come in from other stars, and then you've got cosmic rays that stream in, that's part of the solar wind that's coming in and seeing us. Well, when they come in, they can be, tera electron volts, which is highly, that's the charge, yeah. So they're tera electron volts, and when they come in and they interact with other particles, they shatter out. In fact, the other night I thought I actually got hit by one hit one of my nervous system. It's the first time in my life I'd ever experienced anything like it. The whole world turned blue for like 4 seconds as I was waiting for my body to come back online. It was totally insane. So it was like I got hit by electricity just laying there in bed for a split second, and everything was just, I was sitting there waiting for it to come back, and then all my senses came back on at one time. So jeez. Yeah, it was weird. So the first time I've ever experienced that in my life. So, but and I'm thinking, what in the world can this be? But they come into the planet all the time, and if they hit your DNA, that's why they limit the number of hours that pilots and stewardesses can fly over the polar regions.
Oh yeah, aircraft. Yeah, you're getting hit with a lot more radiation.
Right,
there.
Right. Yeah. So there's more here too, because we're higher up. The higher you are, the more you get.
I told you about when I flew to Alaska how high the radiation was when I tested, didn't I? It got up to 4.2 microsieverts. Wow, that's high, man. Right, it was at like 0.1 or 0.08 on the ground at the airport, and then it was crazy. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. So anyway, so those particles come in, they stream into the planet. So when we have a lot of them come in, you have aurora borealis, because they're energizing the gases in the atmosphere, and dependent upon what color you see determines the altitude and the charge. And if you ever see white, it's everything is ionized then, because you've got red, blue, and green. But if it's all glowing white or a purple color, that's all kinds of power.
Okay.
It's extremely charged.
So
that's how I can judge a storm, just by looking at the colors of
the lightning.
You can see that in lightning. I was talking about aurora borealis. But if you've got purple lightning or purple aurora, there's a whole lot of energy.
What's a teravolt?
I believe it's 1 trillion volts. Yeah.
So that's 1 trillion volts.
Yeah.
Wow. And you said that comes in.
That's each particle is charged to galactic cosmic rays, which can be charged even more than cosmic rays. Galactic cosmic rays can be 7 to 11 tera electron volts. Yeah. And it's tera electron volts. It's not like DC voltage.
How is that different?
I'd have to read it back to you. It's been too many years, but to give it to you in the actual voltage of what that would be. It's electron volts as opposed to like volts in the wall.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's still high like voltage potential like that.
I see.
Same difference. But you wouldn't look at it as it's instantaneous potential, and it sheds that off as it impacts more. They say they look like sparklers coming in. As soon as they start making contact, they shower out more particles. But those particles are floating through the atmosphere, the stratosphere. They're coming in, and as they interact with gases or other particles or anything else that's in the atmosphere, they'll make what's called cloud nuclei, which is particles which are technically referred to as aerosols, because they can stay aloft, and they're anywhere from 50 to 100 nanometers in size, and that 50 to 100 nanometers in size is perfect, which is also, by the way, this about the same size as a coronavirus, 100 nanometers.
Okay.
But anyway, so 50 to 100 nanometers is perfect in size for the moisture to condense on, and that's the lightning of the sky. That's why the sky is more light blue when you have a weak sun than dark blue when you have a strong sun, because when you have a strong sun, it pushes the galactic cosmic rays away, and the sun has magnetic filaments that come out, and they attract those particles that are coming out, so it kind of more or less keeps the particles to itself.
So is it acting as a shield, like a sheath essentially, that wraps around this magnetic field wraps around the Earth more, so it's blocking the galactic cosmic rays?
Well, no, that's part of the heliosphere. So when the sun is strong and you're at a solar maximum as opposed to a solar minimum, which is different than a grand solar minimum, because a grand solar minimum, like I said, you got to have 3 sequential solar cycles that have a 30% drop in each, and then on either the 3rd cycle or the 4th cycle, you have to have a double peak, and the double peak is higher on the second. The second peak is higher.
When you say peak,
it has 2 peaks. It peaks, drops off, and peaks again. So at a normal solar cycle, it doesn't. There's just 1 peak, or there might be something small, but in a grand solar minimum, there is a significant either gap or distance or number of sunspot difference, and that difference shows you when the second peak is higher number. So say your first peak was 150 sunspots at once, and your second peak is 170 sunspots at once. The second peak has to be higher. If the first peak was 170 and the second was 150, then it would not qualify as a grand solar minimum, because you have to have the second peak has to be higher than the first peak. That's part of the footprint. That's how you recognize a grand solar minimum. So when people say, what day did the grand solar minimum begin? You can say exactly the day that the peak of the second peak at its peak is the beginning of the grand solar minimum.
Has that happened yet?
Yeah, that's happened years ago. That's why I've been preaching grand solar minimum for 5 years, because we've known it that long.
Okay. So we are in a grand solar minimum.
We've started it. Okay, so we're not in it yet. This is the worst part of this is going to be from 2028 to 2032 is when we're going to be the farthest out of phase. And people look at the fields and they go, oh, well, like one's a 7 and the other's a 8, you add those together and that's what the peak is going to be. Well, no, those two magnetic fields are out of phase with each other. So you're not adding 7 and 8 together to get 15. You're adding 7 and 8 together to get a -1, because the 7 is the positive and the 8 is the negative. And so you're ending up with a -1 as opposed to a 15. That's a significant difference. And so we're going to see that. In fact, I've been experiencing things up here with touch screens and all kinds of other stuff since I've been up here.
You had issues with GPS, and I had issues with GPS when we went and did our first tour around.
Yeah, the GPS has been insane. In fact, we should have brought my other one. I forgot to get that, but I've got it uploaded stuff in here, and when we get up here on the Mesa, I can finish loading. I've got topos going into both of those machines.
Cool.
So we'll be able to get everything that was there. So anything that's an old bed or what have you, even if it's a fire trail, it should be on that map.
That's a good sign.
Yeah.
Now, so let's go back to, I understand the 3 and the 30%, and then you said the 2 peaks. So after there's 3 decreases of 30% sun activity over the course of...
So it can be during the 3rd cycle.
Okay.
So you got say your first cycle is 130 sunspots at the peak.
And these are 11-year cycles?
11-year cycles.
Okay.
So during the peak, you were at 130. Okay. So then the next cycle comes by 11 years later, and at its peak, you were 100. Then during the 3rd cycle, it comes through at its peak, and its peak is only 70. Okay, now there is the first sign that you're in a grand solar minimum. You've had 3 that decreased by a minimum of 30%.
Right.
During that 3rd cycle, or the 4th, you will have a double peak. And the 2nd peak of that solar cycle will be the beginning of the grand solar minimum. That will mark it, for sure. That's the beginning, because it's all downhill from there.
So, I guess I'm just missing the point of the peak. Like, what would the peak be considered when you have the peak in the 3rd cycle? What is that?
You've got 2 peaks. So normally it comes up and has 1 peak. That's the highest number of sunspots for the year.
Right. Okay.
So what happens is it goes up, like it goes to the highest number of sunspots.
Yeah.
Say it's 150.
Okay.
And then it starts dropping off again.
And then it goes back up to 150.
And then it jumps back up. No, within a matter of a year or 2, even months, it will jump up to something 20% or more than the first peak that you got. So at the 150, you'll jump up to 170 or 180, what have you.
Okay.
You'll jump up to that, and then it'll drop off.
Now I get it.
And then when it drops off that second time, because that second peak was higher, there ain't 3rd. I don't know of any that's had 3 peaks. It's always that second peak. But when that second peak is, head and shoulders above the first peak, you got it. And so that day in April of whatever year it was, I can't even remember now, but when that happened,
was it like 2012?
Something like that. I don't remember. I'll have to go back and look.
That'd be a trip if it was 2012, just because of the Mayan prediction that was way overhyped. Yeah. But it's interesting how Hollywood can take something and go with it. Now the next doom date's supposed to be like next week is supposed to be the real 2012 date.
Yeah, I think it's actually 2014 is what I think it was. But we'll look it up. Anybody can look it up. I've actually got it in the phone.
So 6 years ago, because you said 5 years, that would make sense.
Yeah, I've been preaching about it for about 5 years, so yeah.
Now, with that said, now it makes sense. I completely understand. Thank you for explaining that. That makes sense now. Now I get it.
Right, and people say, oh, well, we don't know when it began. We do.
Yeah, you do.
We know exactly when it began. That's how we knew to name it the Eddy Minimum. Okay? Because Jack Eddy's the guy that discovered it. And him and John Casey's work led to the 3 books that John Casey wrote. Upheaval, Cold Sun, and Dark Winter. All about the grand solar minimum. And I explain all of this in his books. I mean, I've interviewed him